By the hospital bed, with fluorescent lights humming overhead, Ruth Anderson held her grandson's small hand. The 9-year-old boy, Marcus, looked up at her with eyes too wise for his age. His father, Ruth's son David, lay in the hospital bed between them, his face pale against the white pillows. The kidney failure had come suddenly, aggressively. Without a transplant soon, the doctors said, time was running out. Ruth was 72 years old. Her dark skin showed the years beautifully, like rich leather that had softened with time. Her gray-streaked hair fell in natural curls around her shoulders. She had raised David alone after his father left when he was just 3 years old. She had worked double shifts at the textile factory, gone without meals, sacrificed everything to give him a good life. And now, standing in this sterile room, she faced an impossible choice. Her daughter-in-law, Crystal, had cornered her in the hallway earlier that morning. Crystal was a striking woman, always perfectly put together, even in crisis. Her blonde hair was pulled back tight, her makeup flawless. Despite the tears, Ruth, Crystal had said, gripping her arm, "You're a match." The doctors confirmed it. "You have to do this. It's your obligation. You're his mother." Ruth had looked into Crystal's blue eyes and seen something cold there, something calculating. In 23 years of marriage to David, Crystal had rarely shown Ruth much warmth. There had always been a distance, a subtle contempt in the way she spoke to her mother-in-law. But now, when she needed something, Crystal's voice dripped with manufactured sweetness mixed with demand. Ruth had gone home that night to think. Her small house on Maple Street held 40 years of memories. She sat in her worn armchair, the one she'd recovered herself 3 times over the decades, and let her mind wander back. She thought about David as a baby, his perfect tiny fingers wrapped around hers. She thought about his first day of school, how he'd cried and clung to her leg. She thought about teaching him to ride a bike, to tie his shoes, to treat people with kindness. She had given him everything. Every dream she'd had for herself, she'd poured into him instead. And he had grown into a good man, a kind man, a man who called her every Sunday, who brought Marcus over for visits, who still asked for her advice. But Crystal had changed things. Slowly, gradually, the visits became shorter, the phone calls less frequent. Crystal always had plans, always needed David somewhere else. Ruth had accepted it. That's what mothers do. They step back, they make room, they love from a distance. Now, lying in her bed at 2 a.m., Ruth stared at the ceiling and faced the truth she'd buried for 23 years. She remembered the night before David's wedding. She had gone to the hotel to drop off some family photos Crystal wanted for the reception display. The door to David's room was slightly ajar. Inside, she heard Crystal's voice, talking on the phone. "Of course I loved him," Crystal had said, her tone flat and buzziness. "He's stable, he's got that good job lined up, and he worships me. It's perfect. Plus, once we're married, I can finally get away from my mother's constant nagging about settling down." There had been a pause, then Crystal laughed. "His mom? God, she's so broken bar simple, factory worker, probably never even left this town, but she'll be easy to manage. David's so devoted to her, I just have to play nice." And she lit it up. Ruth had stood frozen in that hotel hallway, the photo box growing heavy in her arms. She had backed away silently, left the box at the front desk, and never said a word, because she loved her son, and she knew that truth, sometimes, causes more pain than silence. She had watched over the years as Crystal isolated David from his friends, from his hobbies, from her. She had watched Crystal roll her eyes when David suggested visiting his mother. She had heard Crystal's sharp comments about people who never made anything of themselves. But David seemed happy, or at least content. And there was Marcus, beautiful Marcus, who had inherited his father's kindness and his grandmother's deep brown eyes. For Marcus, Ruth had stayed quiet. For her son's peace, she had swallowed every hurt. Now, as dawn broke through her bedroom curtains, Ruth made her decision. She returned to the hospital that afternoon. Marcus sat in a chair by the window, coloring in a book. David was awake, looking tired and frightened. Crystal stood when Ruth entered, her expression expectant. "I need to speak with David," Ruth said quietly. "Alone?" Crystal's jaw tightened. "Whatever you need to say, you can say in front of me." "I'm his wife." "Alone," Ruth repeated, her voice gentle but firm. Something in her tone made Crystal leave, though she did so with visible reluctance. Ruth sat down beside her son's bed and took his hand. "David," she said, "before I answer about the kidney, I need to tell you something. Something I should have told you a long time ago." David's eyebrows furrowed. "Mom, what is it?" Ruth took a deep breath. "The night before your wedding, I overheard Crystal on the phone. She was talking about you, about us, about why she was marrying you." She told him everything, the words Crystal had used, the coldness in her voice, the way she had calculated the marriage like a business transaction. David's face went through a series of changes: confusion, disbelief, hurt, and finally, a terrible recognition. "I've seen signs," he whispered, "over the years, little things, but I told myself I was imagining it, or that it was just a broken bar. How marriages are." "I'm sorry," Ruth said, tears streaming down her face. "I should have told you then, but you seemed so happy, so in love. And then Marcus came, and I thought a broken bar. Maybe I had misunderstood. Maybe she had grown to truly love you." David was quiet for a long time. "She doesn't know you're a match, does she?" he finally asked. "For the kidney?" Ruth shook her head. "The doctors told me privately. They thought I might want time to consider before deciding." David looked at his mother, this woman who had sacrificed everything for him his entire life, and felt something crack open in his chest. "I can't ask you to do this," he said. "Mom, you're 72. The surgery, the recovery, the risk a broken bar. You're not asking," Ruth said. "I'm offering, because you're my son, and I would give you every part of me if I could. But I needed you to know the truth first, because you deserve to make your own choices with open eyes." The door opened. Crystal stepped in, her impatience barely concealed. "Well?" she demanded. "Have you decided, Ruth? David needs this. We need this. Marcus needs his father." Ruth stood up. She looked at Crystal, really looked at her, for the first time without the veil of politeness and accommodation she had worn for 23 years. "Yes," Ruth said, "I'll do it." Crystal's face flooded with relief. "Thank God." "When can we schedule?" But, Ruth continued, her voice steady, "David and I have some things we need to discuss with you first. About the future, about honesty, about what family really means." Crystal's eyes narrowed. "What are you talking about?" David spoke up from the bed, his voice weak but clear. "Sit down, Crystal. We need to have a conversation, a real one." The surgery was scheduled for 3 weeks later. In that time, many things changed. David and Crystal started marriage counseling. Crystal initially resisted, then broke down in the second session, admitting to resentments and disappointments she had never voiced. The counselor helped them begin to communicate honestly for the first time in years. It wasn't easy. There were tears and arguments. Crystal had to face her own shallow motivations and the way she had treated Ruth. David had to acknowledge the ways he had ignored warning signs to maintain peace. But slowly, something shifted. Crystal began to see Ruth not as an obligation or an embarrassment, but as a woman of tremendous strength and grace. She began to understand what she had failed to appreciate. Marcus, wise beyond his years, watched it all. One evening, he climbed into his grandmother's lap as she sat in the hospital waiting room before a pre-surgery appointment. "Grandma," he said, "are you scared?" Ruth wrapped her arms around him. "A little," she admitted, "but more than scared. I'm grateful. Grateful I can help your daddy. Grateful for every moment I've had with you. Grateful for this life, even the hard parts." "I'm grateful for you too," Marcus whispered. "You're the best grandma in the whole world." The morning of the surgery, Ruth woke up calm. She had written letters to David and Marcus, just in case, and tucked them in her bedside drawer. She had made peace with her decision. In the pre-op room, her family surrounded her. David held one hand, Marcus held the other. Crystal stood at the foot of the bed, her eyes red from crying. "Ruth," Crystal said, her voice breaking, "I'm so sorry for everything, for how I treated you, for what I said all those years ago, for not seeing what an incredible person you are." Ruth smiled. "We're family," she said simply. "We move forward, we do better. That's what love is." The surgeries took 8 hours. Both were successful. Ruth's kidney began functioning immediately in David's body, a perfect match, as if their connection went deeper than blood, down to the cellular level. Recovery was slow. Ruth, as the doctors had warned, had a harder time than her son. But she was toughened by years of factory work and single motherhood. Marcus visited every day after school, bringing drawings and stories. Crystal came too, bringing soup and books and sitting with Ruth for hours. One afternoon, Crystal took Ruth's hand. "I'm going to spend the rest of my life being the daughter-in-law you deserved from the beginning," she said. "I promise you that." Ruth squeezed her hand. "Just love my son," she said. "Really love him. That's all I ever wanted." 6 months later, at Marcus's 10th birthday party, Ruth sat in her backyard watching her family. David was healthy again, color back in his face, throwing a baseball with his son. Crystal was setting out food, and she caught Ruth's eye and smiled. A real smile, warm and genuine. Ruth thought about the moment in that hospital room when Marcus had asked if she should tell the truth. She thought about all the years of silence, of swallowed hurt, of loving from a distance, and she thought about how sometimes the greatest acts of love require us to speak, to risk comfort for honesty, to break silence for truth. Her kidney, her piece of herself, lived on in her son, keeping him alive, keeping him here. But the real gift, she thought, wasn't the organ. It was the conversation, the truth, the chance for real connection. That night, as the sun set and the party wound down, David sat beside his mother on the porch swing. "I never thanked you properly," he said, "not just for the kidney, for telling me the truth, for loving me enough to risk everything." Ruth leaned her head on her son's shoulder. "That's what mothers do," she said. "We love you enough to let you know when you need to wake up. We love you enough to tell hard truths. We love you enough to give you everything we have." They sat in comfortable silence, swinging gently, watching the fireflies begin their evening dance, and Ruth felt, for the first time in 23 years, completely at peace. A